Hello and welcome to this video in which we're going to take a look at absolute value equations and inequalities. To begin with, we first need to understand what absolute value is. An absolute value is denoted by these symbols. So for example, I could have -5 inside of the absolute value symbols. When I think about a number line, I'm going to find where number -5 is located on a number line. But absolute value always means the distance away from 0. And because of that, it will always be positive. So in this case, -5 is 5 spaces away from 0. So the absolute value of -5 is going to be 5. What other value is 5 spaces away from 0? Well, continuing this thought, if I go 5 spaces in a positive direction, I can also say that +5 is 5 spaces away from 0. So the absolute value of 5 is also equal to 5. Why am I reviewing this? Let's look at equations first. If I know that the absolute value of x minus 3 is equal to 5, what this basically tells me is that when I think about the number line once again, I know that I am going to be talking about if I think about what's inside of here, I can say that the x minus 3 will equal +5, which is the 5 spaces away from 0. Or I can also say that the x minus 3 will equal -5, since -5 is also 5 spaces away from 0. So if I go through and solve it, I add 3 to both sides, x can equal +8, or x could equal -2. Why are the two answers? Well, if I plug this in to the absolute value symbol, if I think about it as 8 minus 3, I'm going to get what the absolute value of +5 is, which is going to equal 5. Okay. If I think about it as -2, I have -2 minus 3, which would give me the absolute value of -5, which also equals +5. So in both these cases, I'm going to have, I'm thinking about inside the absolute value symbols, will that value equal +5 or -5? So this will always pretty much happen. So let's look at, first of all, you're going to need to set the equation, or later on when we talk about inequality, to be the absolute value of something is equal to or greater than or less than, okay, whatever the inequality or equality symbol is, some number. You have to do this first. So for example, if I had the absolute value, well, let's say 3 times the absolute value of x minus 3 plus 5 is equal to, let's say it's 14. What I would need to do first is subtract 5, keeping in mind I cannot touch anything inside the absolute value symbols. That has to stay. So then I have 3 times what's in the absolute value symbols is equal to 9. And then I would divide by 3 because it's outside the absolute value. So I would say the absolute value of x minus 3 will equal 3. Okay, this is going to be your first step, is to get it so that there's an absolute value symbol by itself on this one side and then a number on the opposite side. The second part will be to split well, let's say instead of splitting, let's say the second part will be to remove the absolute value bars. Okay. By setting what's inside equal to the positive and the negative value of the number on the opposite. Okay. And then the third step would be to solve each part. Okay, so ordinarily you're going to come up with two solutions. What step 2 means is that I'm going to take the x minus 3 that's inside, set it equal to positive 3, and take the x minus 3 and set it equal to negative 3. If I solve, I add 3 to both sides. I'm going to get x is equal to 6. And then if I add 3 over here, I'm going to get x is equal to 0. So check. Okay. If I go back up to the beginning part, does 3 times the absolute value of 6 minus 3 plus 5 equal to 14? Well, it's 3 times the absolute value of 3 plus 5, so 3 times 3 is 9. 9 plus 5 is equal to 14, so that checks. On the second part, 3 times the absolute value of 0 minus 3 plus 5. 3 times the absolute value of negative 3. Absolute value of negative 3 becomes positive 3. 3 times 3 plus 5, 9 plus 5 is equal to 14. So that will check as well. Okay, so this is basically equations. Just as equations will ordinarily give two solutions. Okay, the exceptions to this come when you have the absolute value of something equals 0. This will actually only give you one solution. Okay, the reason being, if I try and do a positive 0 and a negative 0, that doesn't make any sense. So really, it's what's inside is equal to 0 in your set. The other exception is when what you have inside the absolute value is equal to a negative number. This is when you will have no solution. The reason being, what's inside, or the absolute value of some number, always has to equal a positive. But remember, this only happens when I get the absolute value by itself. Now that we've taken a look at equations, let's begin to look at inequalities. Okay. Once again, you need to remember the absolute value is the distance away from 0. Okay. The two examples we can have the absolute value of something is going to be less than a number, or we can have the absolute value is greater than a number. Once again, I should ordinarily end up with two parts to these inequalities. And if you think about these as being the distance away from 0, if I think about it being less than 5, it's saying that the distance that x minus 3 is away from 0 is less than 5. So if I start at 0 as the marking point, I would need to go out 5 in this direction to positive 5, and I would go out this direction to negative 5. These are the spaces where x minus 3 would be 5 spaces away from 0. So looking at this, because I'm looking at a range basically from negative 5 to positive 5, this will end up giving me an and statement. Okay, and I can represent this by saying negative 5 is going to be less than the value of x minus 3, which is going to be less than the value of 5. Once again, it's because it's representing this space all in the middle of here and saying the boundaries are going to be -5 and +5. So now I have an and statement that I can then solve. Okay. So then I would add 3 to all 3 parts, and I'm going to end up with -2 is less than x, which is less than 8. Okay. These are the values where if I plug it into this inequality, I'm going to get the values that are going to be less than 5. Okay, when I look at the absolute value of these numbers. The second example, where I'm going to change it to greater than 5, I'm looking for the distance away from 0 that is greater than 5. So I'm going to have 5 here, but I'm going to look out in this direction. These are the points which are going to be greater than 5. And then over here as well, I'm going to look here, okay, for my solutions, because it's where it's farther than 5. Okay, this might be 6, 7, 8 spaces away from 0. So greater than symbols will give me an or statement. So instead of setting it up as an and statement, I can say that x minus 3 is going to be greater than 5, or x minus 3 is going to be greater than, going to be less than -5. And where did I get these values? Once again, it's going to take this and have it be a +5 or a -5. So here I'm looking at what are the values that are larger than 5. Here, if I look what I have shaded, it's going to be less than -5. So what that means is that if I add 3, x has to be greater than 8, or if I subtract or add 3, x has to be less than -2. If you think about when we talked about sets and notation, and we talked about complements, what you will notice is that if it's less than, it accounts for the area in here. And then if it's greater than, it's the complement. It's something on the opposite ends. Okay. There are rules. You could memorize that the absolute value, when the absolute value is greater than, it's or. If it's less than, it's and. I tend to think it just through more logically with down here. But I know that this is probably going to need a little bit of practice, so we'll probably work on this into next week. But hopefully this will at least give you a little bit of a basis, a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about. But keep in mind with absolute value, you're always kind of dealing with two values, okay? Once again, though, there are going to be solutions where you're going to end up with no solutions if an absolute value is less than a negative number. It can never be negative, so it can kind of cross out. If the absolute value is going to be greater than a negative number, well, then that's going to be all possible solutions. If it's going to be greater than 0, okay, it's going to be pretty much just the one side as well, okay? But those are kind of rare. If we can get just these kind of basic, that the less than symbol means and, greater than means or, we'll be on the good road.